All right, Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry was one of my very earliest influences on the guitar. As a matter of fact, back in the early 90s, in a very small town in Norway where I started playing guitar, that's what me and my friends were listening to. We were listening to 50s rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis, and also a group called The Shadows out of England. That's the first stuff I really learned on guitar. One of the first songs I could play was Johnny B. Good. You know, Chuck Berry is, one of the real important building blocks in the music of America and the world. And he is the king of rock and roll. And he, as a guitar player, has been very influential on most people. There's, two or three things he did that everybody does. And as a result of that, I also think that to some extent, people have a little bit more narrow view of who Chuck Berry was as a guitar player than what he actually was, because Chuck Berry really had some real depth to the stuff he would play, and a lot of the more quirkier and less accessible things that Chuck would play on the guitar have kind of got fallen by the wayside in the accepted Chuck Berry canon, to put it like that. I mean, the one thing that everybody knows that's a Chuck Berry thing is the rock and roll rhythm guitar that he did, that just became the foundation for rock and roll, really. And I can just talk about that for a second. It's the way he does it is very cool. For one thing, if you listen to old Chuck Berry records, the original ones, there's this push-pull happening between the drums and the piano and the guitar. There's this push-pull thing happening between the drums and the piano and the guitar and the bass, which is very unique and really swings. And it's something that fell by the wayside later on as electric bass became the norm, and the rock and roll music and style became adapted by by another culture, basically by the British and and white kids in America. But if you listen to Chuck Berry and his band, when they had like Fred Below on drums, Willie Dixon on bass, and Johnny Johnson on the piano, you'll hear Chuck Berry, he's playing straight eights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, the straight eighth notes, but the drums often will be playing da-dum, da-da-dum, 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 da, playing a swing beat. And then you got the bass, which is an upright bass, instead of, later rock bass players will play eighth notes on the bass. But on those records, the bass is just going boom, 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 boom. So you got basically like a swing rhythm section, and then Chuck Berry's eighth note guitar going against it, with it, but against it, and it's almost like polyrhythmic, and it's very complex, and it's not at all like the dumbed down version it later will become. So that's about Chuck's rhythm playing, which was super important. Now most people know the classic Chuck Berry type of double stops, lead guitar playing, like that's pretty standard stuff. And there's a good reason for that. It's super cool. It's fat sounding. He didn't have a really distorted guitar sound. He had a pretty clean sound on most of his stuff, and I think to keep up with the big bands and stuff that he was playing with sometimes, he would play double stops, play more than one note instead of he would just do two notes. Should give it more power, a bigger sound, and that became a big part of not just his sound, but everybody's sound that played rock and roll. It's those double stops. But he also had, a bunch of other stuff that he would play that kind of didn't make it into the Rock and Roll 101 book because it's more complicated, it's more jazzy, and it's more quirky, and some things is like sometimes he would start solo with licks like that, and one of my personal favorite Chuck Berry licks involves a bend that he would do, for instance, on Up in the Morning and Out. When he would do in F, he would start, I think there's no particular place to go. He starts with riding along in my automobile. So he goes, and that is that's pretty harmonically sophisticated. It's a C augmented chord that he uses to start off this rock and roll thing in F. And even hipper than that, later in the song, when he gets into a solo, he will take this chord, this chord shape, and he will bend the B and G string up a half a step, and thusly creating an F chord. So it's actually very hard to do. It's very hard to not bend the G string too far and the B string too little. But that's a really cool Chuck Berry band, and that's the kind of stuff that you see that to me makes him really unique. And it hasn't made it into the vocabulary the way his more accessible stuff and licks have. So Chuck Berry is to me, even though he's a super famous guitar player, I still think of him as being somewhat underrated because people, they don't know the full scope of the music that he made, and that's not to mention even anything about his songwriting, his lyrics, and the guy's a genius. I think that's pretty much universally recognized. But just as a guitar player, I think Chuck Berry was super cool, and I've at times kind of taken it upon myself to try and dig deeper into his style, because everybody knows the surface stuff, the surface Chuck Berry stuff. Everybody knows, but not too many people know some of the more intricate stuff he would do, and just his feel, his touch, his sound. Some of those licks are also stuff you don't hear many people play. Chuck Berry today in the in the vocabulary, Chuck Berry has been boiled down to a few very cool but very common elements now. There's a lot there's a lot of cool guitar information to get from Chuck Berry that you'll only find if you kind of, sit down with his records. And everybody knows his records, all the greatest hits, all the stuff that was on Chess in the 50s and early 60s. And there's a lot of depth and finesse to what he does that may elude you upon first listen. But if you dig deep into it, Chuck's got some really cool stuff, and it's kind of to me it's kind of a gold mine of musical tricks and cool guitar stuff, because it's right there, but it's been eluding most guitar players for the better part of 50 or 60 years. So he's got a ton of cool little rigs that he does, and just all kinds of fun little stuff. And I'm gonna get down and play a little Chuck Berry style rock and roll in B flat, along with the band, and I'm gonna throw in some of those lesser known Chuck Berry things, along with the stuff that everybody knows and loves, and also some of my own stuff, because I've also taken some of Chuck Berry's ideas and licks and made my own kind of expansions to them, extensions, if you will. And you'll hear that right now.